Welcome back. As we've been saying, it seems like it's every person for him or herself these days in Trump world. So let's bring in someone who knows a lot about the ups and downs of working for Mr. Trump, a former political advisor to then candidate Donald Trump before and then again during the 2016 campaign. It's our friend Sam Nunberg. Mr. Nunberg, good to see you, sir.
Chuck, thank you very much.
So, look, you know this orbit. So let me ask you first, tell us who Allen Weisselberg is.
Allen, as far as I know, has been with the president, then Mr. Trump, the Trump Organization, since the 70s, since it was even based in Brooklyn, I believe. I think Allen even knew Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father. Every single expense or invoice would either go through, for me, let's say, I would bring it to Donald Trump to sign and then give it to Allen. Anything in terms of budgeting or anything like that I ever had to deal with, Allen was a part of. But what I would also say is everything that I ever saw, and I was asked about this early on in my voluntary, Allen's name was never mentioned in my grand jury testimony. Everything I always saw was perfectly legal and on the up and up. In fact, the president would frequently, when they were doing a business transaction or something, would comment to his attorneys he wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to have to deal with any fines or anything like that. But with that said, this was very surprising when I heard about the subpoena a couple weeks ago. And I think the only reason, Chuck, that we have this subpoena is because of Lanny Davis releasing that tape.
And having the mention of his name. I think you're right on this. When you heard that he was granted immunity, what was your reaction?
Well, my reaction to that is, having been through this process, is that I don't know specifically if it's immunity in terms of whatever you did. The same way that they said David Pecker had immunity, let's say, is that we just want to get all the information possible so we can ascertain whether or not this was a campaign finance violation. Because even though Michael pled guilty to it, Chuck, and you know campaigns better than me, this is one of the first times that we've ever seen something like this in a court of law where somebody has pled guilty. I mean, it's never the closest was Edwards, and he was found not guilty after a jury. So that's what I think they're trying to do, and that's why I would be surprised if the Southern District was interested in the Trump Organization businesses, because I am already sure that Bob Mueller and his team have gone through a lot of the documents. We know that Trump Org has been subpoenaed. And Chuck, when one of the early questions I had from Aaron Solinsky when I walked into my voluntary was, who did Roger Stone work for? And one of the next early questions was, what do you know about the Trump Organization business?
Interesting. Is it fair to say that if anybody understands the labyrinth of the Trump Organization better than President Trump, it's Allen Weisselberg?
Well, certainly the financial. I will tell you that Allen, on the 26th floor, he had his own fiefdom. He had multiple people working for him. There's a large accounting office there. They all report to him. And obviously, you know, the same way, let's say, if there were certain metrics and parameters I had to report to then Mr. Trump frequently, I would get, I can get a frequent call from him, even on something like how many Twitter followers have I gained in the last week. I am sure Allen got frequent had to give frequent reports to then Mr. Trump about the Trump Organization.
How do you think the president reacted to finding out that Weisselberg was granted immunity? As you know, the president described John Dean as a rat. Is he going to be describing Allen Weisselberg as a rat?
Well, I think that what the president, once again, it goes to exactly, I think probably he blames this obviously on Michael as opposed to Allen. Allen was dragged into this. And I would look.
So you think he might forgive Allen here? You don't think Allen's in trouble, or in Trump
I don't think
world,
Allen,
or you do?
No, I don't think Allen's in trouble. And I also don't think that, for instance, even David Pecker, I know Gabriel Sherman reported that Trump made a comment that he flipped. I think even with Pecker as well, they just, look, when you get this subpoena, you have to come in there and you have to tell them everything they want. So I think that in terms of that, I think ultimately if he's blaming anyone, obviously it's going to be Michael and Lanny Davis. So that's where I think this goes in terms of him. What I'm worried, well, I shouldn't say worried. I think the president understands that he can't, well, obviously this is in the Southern District, but he can't do anything to stymie the special counsel's investigation. Because as I said to you a couple weeks ago, that would be like Watergate.
David Pecker, how often did you feel as if that you knew the Trump Organization in some form or another, whether it's Michael, Maybe it was you. Maybe it was Roger. Maybe it was the then candidate or just private citizen Donald Trump. How often was David Pecker or AMI interaction? How often did you see it?
Well, luckily for me, I never dealt directly with David Pecker or anybody at AMI because, as you know, having dealt with the campaign and Trump org over the years, there are pockets and there are chips that you hold about which media people you deal with.
You get to have with, right, and people guard those. No. He's my contact, or et cetera.
That's exactly it. So you explained, and this was with Michael. So I was quite surprised when National Enquirer, as you saw a couple weeks ago, or excuse me, sometime in April, had a cover against Michael, even in the National Enquirer, because I knew that he.
You thought that was Michael's account, is what you're saying.
What I'm saying is Michael was close to Pecker, and it was known within the organization that, Michael deals with National Enquirer the same way, let's say, I deal with Mark Levin or something along those lines.
Right. So what is that? So it's interesting. So is David Pecker turned on the president or not? You don't seem to think so.
No. Well, it's funny when they talk about that safe, what's in that safe. I think there are a lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle, and I think a lot of celebrities that are worried about what's in that safe. So I don't think necessarily. What I think, once again, is they probably wanted the context of the Karen McDougal deal. If I had to guess, there was really nothing. He wasn't. There was really nothing else I would say. But look, there was obviously a connection between National Enquirer and the Trump org, as you reported during the primary. Remember, they sequentially went after every single person that was a threat to Trump, from Carson to Rubio to then Ted Cruz. Yeah,
it is hard not to see that pattern there. I am curious about this one last aspect of sort of where this is headed, which is the president fear? I think it was Tim O'Brien that wrote this, the price of one-way loyalty, right? There's always been, the greatest criticism I've heard over the years when it comes to people that have worked closely with Donald Trump, it's the feeling is loyalty matters, but it's a one-way street. Is that a fair description?
I think in some cases, certainly in some cases it is. And that's why, as I've said, even though I don't agree with what Michael has done, I don't agree with Michael trying to get this president impeached with Lanny Davis, I sympathize with the way Michael feels, having not gotten a job at the White House. I don't understand why they couldn't have simply even just given him something in the EOB. And Chuck, wouldn't that have worked out a little better than it has now, right? So I think that in terms of loyalty and things like that, look, there have been a lot of people through there. But with that said, I would tell you that this coming, surrounding cloud of impeachment, and that's what it is now. It's not the Russian cloud anymore. That brings people like me back into the orbit of being a supporter of his, because I don't think that he should be impeached ultimately from an investigation that only started because he fired James Comey.
All right, Sam Nunberg, I will leave it there. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.